Hey there. Thanks for tuning in. You ready for another episode of My Bigfoot Sighting? Alright then, let's do this.
Seen a bunch of run-down no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves and the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.
My Bigfoot sightings have occurred over a number of years, and the first actual experience I had wasn't a visual sighting necessarily. It happened when I was on an expedition with the BFRO in the Pennsylvania forests. And I actually had gone on because it all goes back to, as a young kid, seeing the movie Sasquatch, The Legend of Bigfoot with my dad in the theater. And he and I went to see the movie, and I couldn't sleep for a month. Literally, I thought a Squatch was going to stick its arm through my window. So I learned later on there weren't any Bigfoot on Long Island. But then I moved down here to Jersey, and we have the Pine Barrens, which is 1.5 million acres of forest. And there are a number of sightings down here, but I'll get to that in a little bit. I just want to first off thank you for having me on as your guest on the 55th anniversary of the Patterson-Gimlin film. That happened to have been in the movie Sasquatch, The Legend of Bigfoot. And so I remember seeing Patty walking across the big screen. And I'll tell you what, that image never left my mind. Although I said there was a time between then and when I moved down to New Jersey that I really didn't give much thought to it. But back in 2006, I was kind of going through a separation, and I had some extra time on my hands. So I got onto the internet, and I came across the BFRO's website, and I very quickly learned about encounters and sightings in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. New Jersey. I couldn't believe it. So I got involved, and I started talking with other researchers, and we would chat on Messenger and go back and forth and discuss different happenings that we had in our neck of the woods. And in 2008, I actually signed on to attend the Pennsylvania BFRO expedition. And I drove out to PA, and I got there a night early, and I set up my tent, and I'm in the office at the campground, and they had shirts available for the Jacobs creature. So I'm purchasing a shirt, and in walks another guy looking all disheveled, and he had come in from the forest, also having spent another night prior to coming. And it was my friend Todd Prescott. Well, we actually became friends, but I didn't know him at the time. So in walks Todd, and we decided to set up next to one another. And then we had another guy show up the next day who joined us, and we kind of had like a threesome. He was a guy from Ohio. But the first night we went out, and we had a few other teams also going out, and we decided to just go and do a little scouting. So not really much activity on that first night. The second day, on Thursday, was when the actual start of the expedition began. And so we went and scouted out an appropriate campsite, and we set up. And then it turns out at the meeting that we had that afternoon that another group from New York had actually claimed that site, apparently. So Todd was very gracious and agreed to pull up our tent stakes, and we went out seeking another location, which, wound up with us actually getting a site that really wasn't conducive. There was a lot of bear sign around and bear scat. And the belief is that if there's two apex predators nearby, there tends to, not be a lot of Squatch activity then. So the first night wasn't so active. The next day we went out and we looked for a different campsite, which we found off the side of a lake up on a hill. And we set up camp there. And let me tell you, we wound up getting some really nice wood knocks that evening. It's a really funny story, actually. We were preparing our meal, and we had a thermal camera set up aimed at the woods, and we saw a heat signature show up on it. So Todd goes out to check out what's out there, and very soon afterwards, the heat signature disappears. So he comes back, we go about making dinner, and it shows up again. So this time, the gentleman from Ohio goes walking out, and I'm on the wrong channel of the radio. I had night vision. Todd was on the therm, and we can see the heat signature, and Tom actually is out there, and he's wearing night vision goggles on his head. And so I'm radioing him, hey, it's on your right, but I'm on the wrong channel, so he can't hear me. And so Todd sees this image get bigger. And so he radios Tom. He says, it's on your right, and it just stood up. And so Tom goes into a crouched position. Turns out he was armed, and he pulls out a 9mm, and he starts spinning around because he doesn't know where this thing is. He's not seeing it on his night vision. Well, very quickly we realize it's a deer. So Todd radios over to him and says, don't worry, it's just a deer. So we're kind of like at that point laughing, he and I, because, that nervous tension, when things you find out are okay. So Tom comes walking back up to the campsite, and I'm still laughing. And he says, I don't think it's very funny. I don't think it's funny at all. I might think it's funny tomorrow, but right now I don't think it's very funny, which made me laugh even harder. Okay. Which I know I was being a jerk, but he had to be there. So after we ate and everything, I was feeling kind of guilty and feeling bad about laughing. So I said, it's my turn. So I say I have to go out and use the facility. So I walk out there with just a red LED on, and, I figure they're going to mess with me. So I walk out about 200 yards, and I take a leak on a big tree. And then I move to my right, and I hear them calling, saying, there's something on your right. There's something on your right. And I'm thinking, yeah, they're just messing with me, right? So I pick up a branch from the ground, and there's a stump in front of me, and I beat the heck out of this stump. And just as I get finished, I hear from the hillside up in front of me come from up on the hillside. And I said, whoa, that was a knock. But it was only a single knock. That means don't come any closer. So I turn and I call back to them. I said, I got a knock. And they're like, huh? I got a knock. So at that point, I'm feeling a little uneasy. All right. And I walk back to the site, and I come back and I tell them I got a wood knock, and they're kind of skeptical. And turns out I had a digital recorder in my pocket. So I pull it out and I rewound it and played it for them. And they're like, yeah, you got a knock. Well, Todd, being the researcher with a lot more experience, says, well, we got to make sure there's nobody else around. Could be other researchers or other campers. So we wind up walking up the forestry road for almost a mile just to make sure there's nobody else nearby. And in the process, we wound up doing some back and forth provocations, doing some knocks back and forth using we had a blast block, which is a percussion instrument, if somebody doesn't know that. And we wound up getting another knock back. So at that point, Todd was feeling pretty confident that it wasn't made by a human anyway. And it was, most likely a legitimate knock. So we were all excited. We got a couple of knocks. The next morning, we were supposed to go to, the actual base camp and have a group meeting and then an equipment demo. So we're like, well, let's not tell anybody. We don't want everybody coming over to this side of the lake, Well, we get to the meeting. It turns out that Chip's group from New York had a thermal sighting at the campsite where we would have been the night before. So now we're like, wow, that outdoes our couple of knocks. So now we can talk about it. And so, yeah, that was pretty exciting. And the next night, or Friday night, we wound up meeting up with another researcher from New Jersey and his team, and we did some back and forth. He was on the bottom of the hill with his group, and we were up above, and we did wind up getting some more knocks. Saturday night also, we had some more activity, a couple of vocalizations. But Sunday, everybody was packing it in, and Todd decided to stay for an extra day. And I said, well, yeah, I could stay too. So we decided to go back to Camp Chip, where the thermal sighting was 2 nights earlier. And we set up our tents there. And so we eat our dinner, and we take a hike through the forest at night for about 4 hours. We must have gone down every forestry road around. And this is a really remote area. And it's nearby where the Jacobs photos came from. Rick and Tom Jacobs were hunters that had gathered some, I guess you could say trail cam pictures of what they were believed was a juvenile Sasquatch, in case anybody doesn't remember that. But anyway, we get back to our campsite around 4:15, I guess. And Todd says, well, let's get in our tents and hope for the best. And as I'm getting in my tent, he radios me and says, hey, I just heard a scream. Come back out. So we get back out. We walk down the forestry road down towards the swamp area, and he therms it. We don't see anything. So, we head back to camp. He says, hey, say a prayer and hope for the best. So I get in my tent, and we're about 50 feet apart from one another. And I'm laying there on my back. I said my prayer, and not 5 minutes later, I hear from over the berm, which was by the forestry road, the sound of approaching footfalls. Boom, boom, boom. But not only could I hear them, I could feel it, okay? And this comes around to where my head was on the tent. And it was just at that point of the morning where the moon is just about all the way down and the sun's about to rise. And I could see a silhouette on my tent. And I could basically just make out the head and shoulders and upper torso of what this individual was. And literally, like, it crouches down by my head and it takes a deep breath in. It goes, and then I see a hand pressing into the tent fabric right over my head. And I could see the forefingers pressing on the fabric. And I clicked my radio. I had my radio in my hand. So I clicked my radio 3 times because I didn't want to talk into it and scare the poor thing. And no response from Todd. But just then, I hear an approaching vehicle. And where our campsite was, it was right on a 90-degree turn. So this approaching vehicle, just before it rounded the turn, this thing stood up, turned around, and ran through the center of camp, over the fire ring, into the brush on the opposite side of our campsite. And you could hear it running bipedally and then crashing into the brush. And I clicked my radio 3 more times, nothing. A moment later, I hear what sounds like equipment starting up. So I just assumed it was a worker coming to work on the gas lines. And then soon after, Todd comes over on the radio and says, hey, you all right over there? I said, were you walking around outside my tent? He says, no, I wasn't walking around outside your tent. And I'm like, the adrenaline must have been really, my heart was like pounding through my chest. I had never really been camping before, let alone out looking for Bigfoot. And so I very quickly fell asleep, and Todd actually hears the individual come back into camp about 5 minutes later. And his tent flap was facing the swamp. And he tried to unzip the flap of his tent enough so he can get his thermal imager out on a monopad. But it wasn't long enough to get over the dome, and the creature came back through the center of camp. So he wasn't able to capture it on therm. And he and I both had digital recorders out. And his was on a camp table in the center of camp. Mine was stuck in a tent flap, aiming at the game trail to my left. The next morning, I woke up about 10 a.m. Todd's all broken down, ready to go. He says, hey, go get your trail camera and I'll help you with your tent. And we, said our goodbyes and headed home. But neither one of us picked up anything on the audio, which was really, we call that the curse of Squatch, or the Squatch curse, So he and I were invited back a couple of weeks later to attend the second expedition, but due to scheduling, we weren't able to attend. So we went back 3 weeks later. And we figured, the area was probably squatched out now, having had 2 expeditions. So we, decided just to be campers, and that we would just, make our meals and play music and just be natural, right? So we take a day hike around the area where the Jacobs photos were taken, and we're about 100 yards apart. And he radios me and says, "Hey, do a wood knock." I said, "Copy that." I look around, I find a branch. I did 3 wood knocks, and then I hold my digital recorder up in the air, and a minute later, we hear a response knock. And I radio him. I said, "Hey, I just got a response." He goes, "Copy that. I heard it." So that was pretty cool to actually have a response in daytime, in an area where there's been known history. So, of course, again, Todd with his Occam's razor and making sure there's nobody else around. We had to climb the rest of this hill to make sure there was nobody there who potentially made this wood knock. So that was my first experience out in the forest. And let me tell you, I'll never forget the intensity of having that experience with something coming up on me at 5 o'clock in the morning and pressing their hand on my tent. So that's really what set it off for me. The next year was when I had my first Bigfoot sighting, and that was in British Columbia. I was invited to attend an expedition in British Columbia on the Sunshine Coast in 2009. So that was a journey in itself, flying out there and then taking the trolley and the bus and the ferry to get to where I needed to be. And the organizer picked me up and drove me out to base camp. And it was just he and I the first night. Again, I got there early. And he had a camper set up. And so once we got there, it was kind of late. He's like, "Okay, that's your bed. I'm going to take the bedroom." So I'm sleeping on a cot right as you enter the camper, right? And he says, "Oh, and leave the door open." I'm like, "Oh, great. My first night in British Columbia, and he wants me to leave the door open." I'm bait. So we had activity every night. Let me tell you, even during the day. On the first night, though, we had this power knock that came from the hillside up above us. It was right after the women of the group had taken a hike around the trail with their red LEDs on their headlamps, and they came back into base camp. And from up on the hillside in front of me, this knock sounded like artillery fire. And I just grabbed the camp chair and I went, "Oh my God." And Rob, the organizer, gets up with the baseball bat and goes running over to the knocking tree and does a return knock. And I remember thinking to myself, "No, wait." But after that, there was no more activity that night. But we had so much great stuff happen. I had trees pushed over. I remember going to a place where there was a report of a 9.5 foot tall alpha male, all black hair and really, really big. It was a place called No Name Lake. And me and Rob and another guy were set up there. And we had all our stuff ready to go. We get all our gear out and our snacks out. And very soon after it started to get dark, we hear this power knock again, like artillery. Then there's a tree gets pushed over, and I'm taking notes. I'm going, "Oh, this is going to be great." I'm writing down notes. Then another artillery. It sounds like a shell blasting. Then another tree gets pushed over. I'm thinking, "Oh my God, this is it. This is going to be my in-my-face encounter." And Neil turns on his equipment, his recording equipment, and it goes, "Boop." And after that, nothing. Not a peep. And I mean, we did everything from call blasting. I walked down this forestry road and left them sitting back at the camp. And we did back and forth provocations, complete darkness, no moon. Couldn't see my hand in front of my face. And I remember being out there by myself thinking, "You know what? What am I, nuts? I'm out here with people I just met. There's a 9.5 foot tall Bigfoot in the area. And they could just pick me up and walk off with me and nobody would even know what happened." So at that point, I headed back to join the others. And unfortunately, like I said, we didn't have any more activity on that evening. Well, the last morning, all the other attendees had packed up and left. I was still there because I was staying another night. And I was sitting down in the creek bottom, down below where base camp was set up. And where we were, there was a waterfall, but because of the drought, it was mainly dried up. So I'm sitting down there and I did a little affirmations and prayer. And I look up on the waterfall in front of me and I see the head and shoulders of an auburn colored individual, about 70 yards away, I would say. And there's some boulders and branches blocking the lower portion of its body. And I thought to myself, that wasn't there a moment ago. So I had my digital camera in my left hand, and I raised it up and I zoomed in and I took a picture. And then I remember hearing people say, oh, if you, turn around and take pictures over your shoulder, you might get them standing up and walking away. So I tried that, and I turn around, I take a couple of pictures. I turn back around and it's gone. And I'm like, I'm kicking myself now for turning around. But I took another photo as a comparison shot, and I thought I saw a second individual higher up on the hillside standing next to one of these big old spruce trees. And I walk back up the hill to base camp, and I tell Rob that I think I saw a squatch. He sticks my SD card into his laptop, and we review the photos. And he says, yeah, I think you saw a squatch, because you could make out it was blurry, of course. They're all blurry, right? But you could make out the eye sockets, and you can see where the face was, where there was no hair around the cheeks, and I took the before and after, so you could compare the two and see that in the first photo, there's something there, and in the second photo, there wasn't. So I felt pretty good. And when I had the experience, let me tell you, it wasn't like the in-my-face encounter I was hoping for at No Name, okay? But I remember the hairs on my arm standing up, and I had this just a feeling of calm come over me. I didn't have any fear. It wasn't like any anxiety or anything. It was just like a calm. So I don't know how else to explain it, but a lot different than my first experience in Pennsylvania. I will say that. So after that, I continued doing my research in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. I was out on Thanksgiving morning. Because of my separation from my ex and my kids at the time, I would go out on holidays just to keep out of my own head, if you know what I mean. And I discovered I had a love of the forests and the outdoors, and that really helped to keep my head clear. So I was out there, and it had snowed overnight. And so I figured, let me go out and look for tracks. So I'm out there in an area that we've had some reports. At this point, it's like 10:30 in the morning, and there's a light covering of snow. And I walk over these abandoned railroad tracks, and I take a leak on a tree. And then I had a child's baseball bat with me, and I see a stump. And I did 3 knocks on this stump. And from behind me on the right comes a growl so loud, it vibrated my right ear. And I turned and went, whoa. And then it comes back and it goes, rrr. And I turned and went, whoa, a second time. Rrr. And I'm thinking to myself, about 3 miles from my car, I'm holding a child's baseball bat as my only, source of protection. I go, hello, how are you? Rrr. I said, does this mean you don't want me here? Rrr. I said, okay, I'm leaving. And I turned and I walked back over across the railroad tracks. I stopped on the top of the railroad tracks and I turned and waved. I went back down the other side and got back on the trail that I came in on. And I started heading back in the direction of my vehicle. I occasionally looking back behind my shoulder to see if I'm being followed. So I'm walking back up the trail now towards my car. And I see this game trail going off to my right through a grove of mountain laurels. And I remember, they really love mountain laurels, I think, for nesting and for nursery areas. So I take the trail and I come upon a clearing. And in the clearing is a line of tracks in tightrope fashion. They're only about 12 inches in length. But these tracks were made, obviously, while it was snowing, because there was some snow in the impressions. So they weren't really photo worthy. Okay. And at the end of the clearing, where it started to be a game trail again, there was an arch and an X tree structure and a tree that was snapped off about 5.5 feet off the ground. And I said, this looks like a good place to put my trail camera. So that's what I did. I mounted my trail camera, aimed at the game trail. I had some apples with me, and I had a can of Alpo dog food, this beef stew. So I popped the cap open on the can, and I stuck it in the top of the tree that was snapped off, and I left and proceeded back to my car. It's about a half hour after getting growled at. So turns out didn't wind up getting anything on that game camera footage, but hey, it's always worth a shot. So that was in November of 2010. No, that was 2009. Forgive me. The next experience I had was my road crossing, and that happened on March 18th, in the early morning hours of March 18th, 2010, in the Pine Barrens. I was actually out with a friend of mine who was like a New Jersey Devil enthusiast, okay? So she didn't mind heading out into the woods at night with me. And we had been at one of my areas, and it was misty and rainy and kind of cold. So about 12:30, 12:45, we decide to wrap it up. We call it a night. And we're heading back towards home and just talking about music, not really thinking about Bigfoot. And we're heading back into civilization. I'm in my Oldsmobile at this point. Didn't have a truck yet. And we're coming down the road about 50 miles an hour. And from my passenger side on the right comes out an individual running about 30, 35 miles an hour. And I slam on my brakes and I barely avoid hitting this individual. I guess I was probably about 3 feet from hitting it. And hunched over, running on two legs, it was 3.5 feet over the hood of my car. Because I hit the brake so hard, she slid forward. And I went, deer? She goes, no, it wasn't. And I'm thinking, yeah, you're right. It wasn't a deer. And there actually was a dead deer up a little further in the middle of the road. But this thing tore out of a development down a trail that had chain link fence on both sides. And it kept running. Like it looked at us as it was in front of the vehicle with this like expression on its face as if it was like, oh shoot, like it knew it messed up. You know what I mean? But it kept running. And, you know, after I got past that dead deer, I actually turned around and came back up the road and got out of the car to listen to see if I heard anything, and also to check to see if there was any tracks on the roadside. But it was all hard packed, so there wasn't anything there. But where the trajectory it was running, it would have gone through the home across the street's yard and then onto some high tension electrical wire cuts, okay, which actually these fire cuts with these high tension pole lines takes you back into Wharton Forest. And there's been a number of encounters in the forest as well. So I don't know if it was an opportunist, if it was a juvenile or what, but, you know, I couldn't really tell you specific details aside from the color of the hair was like a strawberry blonde. Like I said, it was about 3.5 feet over the hood of my car, which would put it around the 6.5, 7 foot range. The legs were really thick, probably as almost close to the thickness of my waist. And you could see the hair blowing in the wind. And the hair had to have been 4.5, like 5 inches long. And like I said, it was running and using its arms to kind of propel it faster. But it happens so fast. You know, these road crossings, it's like a blink of an eye. So I couldn't tell you facial features or eye coloration or the nose or if I saw ears. What I do know is that I didn't see a muzzle. I didn't see any horns. I didn't see any tail. You know what I mean? So it wasn't any known creature that we tend to see on our travels into the forest. And if it was a guy in a suit, you know, he'd be toast, okay, because I was moving at a good clip. So that was my road crossing. That was pretty exciting. Of course, I try to recreate that from time to time when I'm heading back from the forest. You know, I'll try to make sure I go down that road and see if it happens again. And it's funny, I've talked to other people, and a couple of times they've said to me, hey, you should just set up a trail camera there. You know, you might catch something. And the reason I say that, I left this out, is because the following night, one of my customers' daughters actually had a exact same situation happen to her. And she had this thing run out in front of her. And then a year later, another woman going in the opposite direction on her way home from work around 11:30 at night also had a road crossing at this exact location. And hence, when I tell that, that's when they say, hey, you should have set up a trail camera there, right? That was when I became a knower. I mean, there's people who say they're believers, and I can honestly say I am a knower. And it was a life-changing experience, I will say that. You know, of course, I became a researcher with the BFRO and an investigator. Back in October of 2013, I think it was when the Finding Bigfoot crew contacted us, the producers, and they had us assist in the filming of the South Jersey Sasquatch episode. And so I was happy to take out the producers to, my areas of the forest and show them around. And we actually got them to come out with us one night and do a night op with us. And it's funny because my girlfriend at the time, Heather, who's now my wife, before they came to meet with us, she did a couple of knocks just to try it out, and we wound up getting a response. I'm like, oh, great. We recorded it, but they weren't here to also observe it, which was a bummer. But yeah, they came and we did the town hall meeting, and I got to talk about my road crossing. But then when it came to filming the episode, Bobo was the one who did my interview, and he wasn't on his A game that day. So I wound up getting edited out of the episode. But after we filmed my reenactment and did the interview, they gave us a radio and were asked to lead the cast and crew out to another area of the Pine Barrens so that they could recreate a poacher's experience, his encounter, which we did. And we got to watch them filming that. And that was a lot of fun. But yeah, when it came time to the actual episode airing, we were watching it in my headquarters here, and my wife turns to me and she says, they edited me out. I said, honey, they edited me out. And later that night, I guess when it aired on the West Coast, Matt Moneymaker texted me. He says, oh, Spinner, that's a bummer. I didn't realize you got cut. He says, well, there's only 44 minutes in an episode. Yeah. I said, yeah, Matt, I get it. I said, well, making me an investigator and an organizer would maybe make me feel better. So he said, no problem. So at that point, I became an organizer. And in June of 2014, I was asked to organize the first New Jersey expedition. And this was set to coincide with the filming of the North Jersey episode of Finding Bigfoot. So they were all in town. And we did another town hall, and we had, all the witnesses come out again. And I wasn't involved in the town hall so much aside from just being a guest there. But that was cool. And then on Saturday night, Matt Moneymaker joined our expedition. And he looked at the topo maps on my laptop, and he says, this is where we're going to go. And he points to an area of marshland, and it was probably within a couple of miles of the Appalachian Trail. And so we head out, and he says, we're not coming back until we get a squatch. He says, I'm going to be really surprised if we don't get something. And so we go out. Heather stays in the truck while we're hiking up this trail. We get to a certain spot, and Matt does a series of his 3 high-pitched calls. And at first we thought we were hearing frogs. And all of a sudden, you can tell this is a series of howls coming from across the marsh. And this squatch just starts going off like, ah! Ah! And yeah, it was pretty exciting to record those howls on my first expedition. I will say that. So I've done a number of these expeditions since then, and we've had a lot of different experiences. And one thing I've always wanted to do was a water ops at night. And we were on the 2020 expedition in southern New York. And we had the opportunity to go out on the lake in a small boat with a trolling motor, which was real quiet, right? So on Friday night, myself and 3 other attendees get in this boat. And I had practiced earlier in the day just to do a trial run, just so I knew a little bit of the lay of the land. Okay. And I took 3 other attendees out there with me. And as we're heading out, I had another team coming down the hillside with their red LEDs on. and they're making a ton of noise. I could hear them from the water, and I radioed them and I said, "Hey, can you make a little more noise?" And so they get to their position on this rock outcropping, and we go past them, and we kind of circle around at the north end of the lake. And I didn't have we were all really cautious about bringing too much gear with us because of the possibility of winding up in the drink, you know. But I had my fireman's therm, okay, and this is a big heavy piece of gear that we didn't have recording capability, but it's a really, really good therm. And it can get wet, and it, you know, that's what appealed to me to take that with me. And I had my digital recorder with me as well. And so I thermed the guys out on the rock outcrop down the other end of the lake. And I showed the other attendees what it looks like. And then I hand the therm to Patty, who's a law enforcement officer. And she's holding the therm, and she kind of pans to the right. And we see an individual on the bank about 40 feet off the edge of the lake. And it's standing there. You can see arms, you can see legs, and it's kind of swaying back and forth, almost as if it didn't know what to do, you know? And so Patty's therming the creature, but of course I'm not recording it. I'm holding the trolling motor. I'm the captain. I'm trying to keep the boat still so she can keep an eye on this thing. And so she hands it to another guy, Frank, and now he's holding the thermal imager. And for 2.5 minutes, we're watching this thing. And I guess about 2 minutes in, it starts gliding up this hillside. And it's like a 45-degree angle. And it glides up this hillside silently. You couldn't hear any rustling or anything. No branch breaks, nothing. And after 2.5 minutes, Frank says, "I lost it." And then 30 seconds after that, we hear this branch snap. It was so loud. And Patty turns to look at me, and we both say, "Did you hear that?" I'll tell you what a great experience that was to actually be on my first water night ops. And we had results like that. It was just so incredible. And there was other activity that took place, of course, on that expedition. And then we had a second, that was the second one. The previous one in September, I left that apart, I'm sorry. But on the previous expedition in southern New York in September, I led a team to the north end of a different lake. And there was a couple of other groups set up at various areas. And we had radio communication. But my team stayed the latest and went the furthest. And as two of my team individuals were leaving, they were going to go walking down the trail to go get picked up by another team that had left to go on the AT. And the leader of that team had radioed me and said, "Hey, I got hit by a rock. I had a rock thrown at me." I said, "Oh, that's great," you know? So when it came time to leave, I wanted to head out on that trail as well and hopefully get hit by a rock too. So the two other guys on my team had decided to walk down a more main trail and get picked up by the other team. So as they're leaving, I don't think they have their radio on. They didn't respond to me anyhow. So I remembered one of them wanting to hear samurai chatter. So I start doing samurai chatter. And at the end of it, I go, "Turn on your radio." And you can see them, you know, scrambling, and their headlamps come on, and they're looking for their radio. And right after that, from across the lake, we get a series of these mournful howls. It sounded feminine to me, like mournful feminine howls coming from across the lake. They sounded like, "Ah, ah," just like that, with about 5-second intervals in between. And I had my digital microphone connected to my high-powered microphones that I had from Kimber Audio. And with the headphones on, it's also like a bionic ear, okay? So I let a couple of the other attendees listen as well. And meanwhile, we're getting it recorded. And I'll tell you what a great way. That was Saturday night to end that expedition. I get into my tent after having a cold burger. We get back to base camp, right? I get into my tent. This is on the September expedition still. I'm laying on my cot, and I had my phone on a cradle to my right, illuminating me, and I had the fire to my right, also causing some illumination. and I'm hearing the owl hooting on the hillside. And then once again, I hear crunch, 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 crunch. Something comes walking up on my tent. This is at, like, again, 10:05 in the morning. And I'm thinking, oh, here we go, you know? And I'm looking to the left. I'm waiting to see something press on the tent fabric. And then I remember, I'm illuminated. I said I was going to pretend like I'm sleeping, but then I remembered that I'm illuminated on the right by my phone. So I reach over and I knock the phone over. So it dims the light. And then I realize the fire is still illuminating me. And I think to myself, well, hey, if this is my time to go, at least I'm going to die doing something I love. And I rolled over and I went to sleep. And of course, you know, I had trail cameras set up in back of and in front of my tent. I had a digital recorder going outside my tent. The digital recorder malfunctioned. I didn't get anything on my trail cameras. So again, the Squatch curse. But I'll tell you what, these are the experiences that I've had out in the field. And those are just a few, obviously. I mean, being on as many expeditions and talking with as many witnesses as I have, you get to experience some things. Like back in BC, I got hit by a rock. I left that part out while I was sitting at base camp. We got to hear, like I said, some power knocks. I've been out in Missouri with other researchers doing some investigations out there, and in a spot where one of the researchers had an intimidation encounter with two juvenile squatches and an alpha male who's about 10 feet tall. That he was so scared, he called me and said, Eric, if I don't make it out of here, tell my wife where I'm at. I said, hey, relax. It's okay. They're not going to hurt you. And I managed to talk him out. And I told him, just don't smile at him, you know, and back out slowly. And just as he was getting close to the road, these two juveniles were kind of flanking him on both sides. He hears a car coming down the road, and both of these individuals went flat on their stomachs. And that's when he turned and tore off to his Jeep and sped out of there. And so I had gone back and I had the opportunity to go out to Missouri and in the Ozarks and go to where this encounter occurred. And let me tell you, that definitely was a likely spot for this to happen. But I'm trying to think if there's anything I left out. I recently got to do a follow-up investigation with one of my attendees from my recent Pine Barrens expedition. Oh, on that one, that was fun. We had on the final night, on Saturday night, I had a team set up by the bogs. And the men left the girls sitting by base camp, and they went over to like the dam area, to the levee. And while the men were off on the levee, the girls wind up having an hour conversation with what we call a lovesick juvenile. So Patty from the New York expedition was again with us, and she was doing these gentle whoops. And this lovesick juvenile would respond. And we have it recorded, about an hour of this whooping conversation going on. I'll tell you what, it's pretty cool. And one of the attendees came walking back with my co-host Nathan, and the two of them wound up hearing two knocks as they were coming back. And this attendee, Jacob, who had this encounter in the Pine Barrens back in 2018, which was, I would call, an intimidation encounter. He took me back there last weekend, and we had some recent wildfires. So the area that he had this encounter is now all burned, but coming back nice. But the shack that was up in the tree, it was like a deer blind, I guess you would say. It was made out of wood, but it had a metal frame. So now there's just metal frame remaining. But I had the opportunity to go back there and do a little recreation with him out in the forest. And I left a trail camera out there with some bait. So, hey, who knows? Maybe we'll get some results from that. You know, it's just great being able to speak with these individuals and to take them out into the forest and teach them how to go about doing this research that I've been doing now for about 15 years. And we have some expeditions planned for June and also one in September. The June expedition is going to be in the Pine Barrens. I'll be leading that one. And then I'll be leading one in Pennsylvania in September of 2023. And yeah, I really enjoy talking about this topic with others. I don't try to shove my opinions down anybody's throat. You know, I'm open to other ideas, but I'm a Bigfoot believer. Flesh and blood guy. I'm open to other thoughts on it, and I'm always happy to discuss it with anybody who wishes to talk about it. And I think I'm the only health food store in America that has a Bigfoot museum built right in. And so, yeah, we happen to have a podcast now that my friend Nathan and I host every week. It's Squatch Talks Podcast, and you can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and even Twitter. And if you don't mind going over and checking us out and giving us a like, hey, even a subscribe, we'd be eternally grateful. We're just having a lot of fun doing this and meeting new people, and the people that we take along with us on our expeditions become part of the Bigfoot family, if you know what I mean. And they tend to catch the Bigfoot bug, which you never know. It does happen. So, yeah, I've often been out there by myself, out in the Pine Barrens, solo hiking, and I've heard a number of strange and unusual things. So we've had so many experiences with what I call Class B encounters, but that doesn't necessarily qualify for My Bigfoot Sighting. So I just want to thank Vic for asking me to be on this anniversary of the Patterson Gimlin film. 55 years ago is what made history in the Bigfoot community. And to this day, I still think is the best photographic evidence that we've had. So I hope you enjoyed listening to my tales, and hopefully we'll go out and make some more real soon. Thanks for squatching.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let us know. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves in the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.